This is a story about how I was almost murdered by a hitman who had the wrong person. This happened to me back in 1988 when I was 22. I lived in Texas in a small town outside of Austin. I was out with some friends on a weekend night bar hopping. My friends' names were Steve, Jared, Darius, and Jesse. We would all usually go out together every weekend, and this was no different than any other night. The night was going really well. We'd stay at each bar for a beer or two, then head to the next one. After like the third bar, Steve pointed out some guy and said he swore he saw him at the first two bars we were at. I told him it was probably just a weird coincidence, and he agreed. But now, I started to pay closer attention to him. He had on jeans and a gray long-sleeve shirt, and there were no noticeable features about him. He had a crew cut and was clean-shaven, and that was about all I could gather. He literally just looked like your average Joe. About 30 minutes later, we went to one more bar. It was around midnight, so we figured maybe another hour or so. I paid attention as we left, and sure enough, that guy quickly went to pay his tab and headed out as well. I told Steve this, and he suggested maybe we walk around the block a couple times, so that's what we all did. The guy didn't follow us, so we assumed it had indeed just been a coincidence. We spent the last hour of our night at that bar, with no sign of the guy. When we left to head home, Darius and Jesse got a cab, while myself, Steve, and Jared decided to walk, as we didn't live too far from downtown. I was by far the most sober of the three of us, so I led the way as we crossed the various streets. We weren't too far from my house when I noticed a man walking, approaching us, coming the opposite direction. I honestly can't even say I was surprised when I saw who it was. I was more terrified than anything. It was a man from the bar. As he walked by, I asked, "Hey man, are you following us?" He retorted with a, "No," and kept walking. I shrugged it off, just wanting to get home. About a block down, I said goodnight to my friends as we were at their house. I still had another half mile to go down the street. I was maybe 100 feet from my door when I heard the sound of someone sprinting down the street coming toward me. I barely had time to turn around before I was tackled to the ground, slamming hard into the concrete. Of course, it was that guy that was following us. We rolled around on the ground for maybe 30 seconds before I got him in a headlock. Now, when I was in high school, I was a state champion in wrestling, so it wasn't difficult to subdue him. I started screaming, yelling what the hell his problem was, saying I was gonna kill him. You know, typical things hot-headed guys yell when they're fighting. I'm guessing one of the neighbors saw this and called the police, because after a couple minutes, an officer rolled up with his red and blue lights flashing. Luckily, he was able to defuse the situation, and pretty soon we were both handcuffed, with several other officers arriving on the scene. I explained the whole situation, about how this guy had been following us and randomly attacked me, and this guy said the opposite. He claimed I had been following him, and that I was threatening his family and a bunch of other BS. Since it was the middle of the night, there weren't really any witnesses, but since I was able to prove that I lived in the house that we were right in front of, they believed my side of the story. They took him to prison, where it was later revealed that the guy was a hired hitman by a drug dealer in my nearby area. Apparently, someone closely resembling me had a lot of debt that he wasn't paying back. Obviously, the hitman had the wrong guy, but the dude that he was after eerily did resemble me a lot. We were the same build, had the same hair color, our faces sort of looked alike, and we even lived near each other. Thankfully, that guy was an awful hitman, because I'm still alive to tell this story. Although, it chills me to the bone, knowing that guy was watching me all night, waiting for the right time to end my life. I'm a big outdoors guy. My entire life, I've always done whatever I can to spend time in nature. I've been hiking, mountain biking, dirt biking, whitewater rafting, you name it. I've definitely had some dangerous experiences, but nothing too crazy. Last fall, in 2022, I went hiking in the Rocky Mountains as sort of a vacation from work. I always go on my adventures by myself, not to sound cocky, but because nobody that I know would be able to keep up with me. I also like to pack as minimally as possible, bringing MREs for food, a hammock instead of a tent, stuff like that. The weekend I was going was supposed to be beautiful, 65 degrees every day, and the fall foliage was in full swing. Once I arrived, I unpacked my car and I was on my way. The first day went by with no issues. I hiked 5, maybe 6 miles, and I was beyond psyched. The second day it was shaping up to be the same as the first. After maybe 2 miles, I stopped at a nearby river to fill my canteen, and I had a weird feeling that someone was following me, even though I hadn't run into anyone that day. I just ignored this feeling and kept moving. After about a half hour, that feeling persisted. I don't know why, but something told me I was in danger, and that I needed to get out of the area immediately. I picked up the pace, and I started to run, when I swear I heard someone laughing behind me. This only prompted me to run faster, not caring about the several rocks and roots I could potentially trip over. That was when the trail took a sharp turn, but by the time I realized there was a drop-off, it was too late. I tumbled down the mountain, bouncing off big rocks on my way down. I hit the bottom hard. I could tell I had broken my collarbone, and I was pretty sure my leg was broken too. I had a hard time breathing from the wind being knocked out of me, and I croaked in pain. As the adrenaline wore off, the pain began to register more and more. I screamed in agony at the sight of my badly wounded leg, knowing I wouldn't be able to get up. I looked back up the cliff, trying to see whoever it was that was chasing me, but I saw no one. I called out for help, praying that whoever it was could send help, but again, there was no response from anyone. I was alone. I looked to my right, and for a brief moment forgot about any pain I had. There was a fallen tree, and it was just a stump, with long pointy branches poking out at least a foot long. Had I fallen only 2 feet to my right, I would have been impaled by a branch, and without a doubt would have been a dead man. At the rate I was going though, I needed help, and I needed it soon. My backpack with my phone was lying about 30 feet from where I lay, but getting to it wouldn't be easy. I doubt I would even have reception out here either, so it would have been futile. As I lie there helpless, I hear someone at the top of the hill. I look up and see a man in a bright red t-shirt looking down at me, smiling. I yelled at him that I needed help, but his facial expression didn't change, nor did he move. I yelled again that I'm hurt and I need help, but his smile only grew wider. I was growing hysterical at this point, and just pleaded that he get someone to help me. To this, he said nothing and walked off. I was petrified by this point. That sick bastard thought it was funny. I truly thought that I was going to die. I figured my phone was my last hope. I started making my way to my bag, but pain shot up my entire body and I was forced to lie back down. I managed to roll onto my stomach, but with my broken collarbone, I couldn't even put any weight on my elbows. I made a worm-like motion with my body, which still caused immense pain, but I was able to move ever so slightly. It would take me hours to get to my bag at this rate, and now the sun was starting to set. I had no choice but to keep moving. I made it halfway to my bag by the time it was pitch black out. I knew that even if I was able to call for help now, there was no way they'd be able to find me. Nevertheless, I kept crawling. Hours went by, and I made it to my bag. I pulled my phone out, and thank God I had 1 bar. That's all I needed. I dialed 911, and I told them everything that happened to me. I did my best to describe where I was, and the dispatch sent out a search and rescue helicopter and for me to stay put. The dispatch lady stayed on the line with me, and that was when I heard howling of some sort. I couldn't tell if it was a wolf or a coyote, but it was close. I also heard the helicopter off in the distance, approaching. I told the dispatch that I heard them, and she told me to wave my phone screen to try and get their attention. I turned the flashlight on my phone and waved it around. It was also at this point there was an animal approaching me. I frantically yelled to try and scare it off, but it wasn't working. The helicopter was almost right above me by now, and the dispatcher said that they could see me and to keep waving my phone. I told her there was a wolf or something near me as well, and she said to make as much noise as possible. I picked up a rock and threw it in the general direction of the animal, and it worked. I could hear it scurrying away as the helicopter descended. I felt nothing but relief as they strapped me into the basket stretcher, and I was med-flighted to the nearest hospital, where I was questioned about what had happened. I told them everything, from the feeling of being watched to being chased off the cliff, and how that man looked at me and smiled. That was when the nurse told me something that to this day I don't fully believe. About a month prior, there was a man who went missing in the same area I was in, and he was also found at the bottom of a cliff, except he hadn't been as lucky. When they found him, he landed on an old log with branches that had impaled him, where he bled to death. She also said that he was wearing a bright red t-shirt. Now, even if this is not true, it still rattles me to the core, knowing that I very well could have met my maker that day, and whether or not the smiling man was real or not, I'll never know. I'm just glad I made it out alive to see another day. Thankfully, I made a full recovery. I still plan to do all the outdoor activities that I enjoy, although I won't be returning to that area of the Rocky Mountains. This is by far my closest near-death experience. I went to college as a commuter, so that meant I had to have a job to pay for my gas. It was just an ordinary Tuesday night. I had just pulled out of the parking lot after I finished up a shift at the movie theater when the low fuel light popped up on my dash. I sighed, and I figured I'd rather fill up now than on my way to school the next day. As I was filling up, I remembered that I had some homework to do, and I figured it would take a few hours, so I ran inside to grab an energy drink. I was at one of those Seasons convenience stores, which are pretty big if you didn't know. I was at the back of the store by the refrigerators, trying to find one of those cotton candy bang drinks, when I heard the chime of the door open. Now, I don't think anything of it as I finally find my drink. I grab it, and as I turn around to walk to the register, I hear yelling, and a big commotion between that guy that just walked in and the cashier. Naturally, this puts me on edge, and I just duck behind one of the aisles until the guy leaves, but that doesn't happen. This is when I had the horrifying realization that he was robbing the place. I slowly peered over the top of the shelf, and my heart jumped into my throat when I saw the cashier with both hands up and the guy pointing a gun at him. He tossed a burlap sack at the cashier and told him to put all the money that he had inside. As this happened, I crouched down in the aisle and debated whether or not to try and escape, when all of a sudden gunfire rings out. At least 5 shots were fired, and a stray bullet went through a can of soup right above my head. I saw it explode, and it sprayed soup all over the place, and I screamed out in horror. I had no idea what had happened. I heard one of the men groaning in pain after that. I slowly pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. I just whispered to the operator that the store I was in had just gotten robbed, and shots were fired. I was still in panic mode. I crawled to the end of the aisle, and as I peered around the corner, the man that had attempted to rob the place was lying in a pool of blood, but he was still moving. He looked up at me, and I just froze. I could barely comprehend when he raised his gun and pointed it at me, and when he went to pull the trigger, all that happened was a click. I just dove back into the aisle and out of sight, and I quietly began to cry. I was sitting there shaking when the chime of the door sounded, and I heard a cop yelling at the man to put his hands on his head. Not too long after that, ambulances had come and taken both the cashier and robber out on stretchers, both of them with serious gunshot wounds. Both of the men survived. The police had asked me a few questions about what happened, and that was really it. To this day, I'm haunted by the fact that I was almost murdered in cold blood, and that the only reason I'm writing this is because he had no bullets left. Never take life for granted, because things can change in an instant. This story takes place back in July of 2017. I was 15 at the time. It was the 4th of July weekend, and my family would always rent a house every year on Long Lake in Maine. We would spend most of the time on the water, and even though I was not a good swimmer, I'd always have a great time. Whenever we'd be out on the boat, my parents made sure we were wearing life jackets, even if we weren't going in the water. My parents were always just really cautious and wanted us to be safe. This particular day, we had set our alarms for 5 a.m. to get out on the lake to go wakeboarding. The main reason for this was because the 4th of July weekend is probably one of the busiest times of the year, so we wanted to get our water sports done before it got too hectic. So 5 a.m. rolls around, and my older brother Jack and I ate our breakfast as fast as we could and met our dad by the boat. He had a 1999 Super Aeronautique, which for those who are unaware, it is a very nice wakeboard boat. It had one of those big towers on the top to hook up the tow rope. I always had a habit of resting my head where the tower connects to the boat, which my dad would always tell me not to do, because when the water got rough, he didn't want me to hit my head. Anyways, my dad, Jack, and I set out on the lake just as the sun started to come up. It was a beautiful day. My brother and I took turns wakeboarding for at least 3 hours, and by the time we were done, I was exhausted. Wakeboarding wears out both your arms and your legs, which mine both were. As we started to head back in the direction of the house, we noticed a dark storm cloud approaching quickly, and I could hear the rumble of thunder over the boat's motor. My dad was pissed, because the forecast had only said it would be overcast. So now we were 30 minutes from the house in the middle of the lake, with a thunderstorm rolling in. As the water started to get rougher, my dad had to slow the boat down. He cursed, but we kept on. At this point, we were in the middle of the storm. The rain pelting our faces felt like ice, and the wind was freezing. As we rode over the waves, Jack and I had to hold on to the sides of the boat as to not get thrown around. This was tough, because there really wasn't anything to hold on to. The last thing I remember was my dad yelling about something, and the feeling of the boat hitting a big wave head on. When I regained consciousness, I was floating in the water. I had on a life jacket, but it was too big for me. As the waves tossed me around, I could barely breathe without being dragged underwater. I couldn't see the boat either. I could hear it off in the distance, but the waves were so big I don't think they could see me. I struggled to keep my head above the water. Every time a wave would hit me in the face, I'd be sucked under for 10 seconds at a time. If I wasn't so tired from wakeboarding, I probably could have managed to stay afloat better. But as time went on, I grew more and more tired. I was losing hope that my dad would find me before it was too late. Even if he did, driving the boat anywhere near me could be extremely dangerous, because in these conditions, he doesn't have much control and could potentially run me over. My vision started to go fuzzy, when finally, my dad found me. He threw one of those life preserver rings to me, and I grabbed onto it. He pulled me back in, and he and my brother helped me get back into the boat. We ended up making it back to the house with little trouble as the storm began to let up. Apparently I had hit my head on the tower, which knocked me unconscious, and I was thrown from the boat. Luckily, I'd only suffered a minor concussion, but this story serves as the closest I have ever come to dying.